Welcome to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris, featuring top business leaders sharing strategies and resources to get to the next level. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey everyone, I'm William Harris. I'm the founder and CEO of Element and the host of the Up Arrow podcast, where I feature the best minds in e-commerce to help you scale from 10 million to 100 million and beyond as you up arrow your business and your personal life. Joining me today is Tamsen Webster. Tamsen is part keynote speaker, part message strategist, and all about building big ideas. She has combined her 20 years in marketing, 13 years as a Weight Watchers leader, and 4 years as a TEDx executive producer into a simple way to change how people see and what they do as a result. Today, we're going to be talking about the 9 principles of lasting change and how to use them to get buy-in and transformational change from your team. Tamsen, I am excited to have you here today.
I am delighted to be here, William. It's lovely. It's always fun to find new and different places to apply these concepts, and I can't wait to talk about them with you.
Yeah, I love that. We're going to be talking about a couple of things. One of those is obviously the 9 principles. I'll give a shout out real quick to your book. I read it. It's very good. We're going to be calling out a lot of different things from here, but I really want to make sure I call out Nancy Harhut, the brilliant author of Using Behavioral Science and Marketing.
So
she's the one who put us in touch.
That's
if
right.
you guys also haven't read this, it's amazing. I reference it almost probably on a weekly basis with my team. It's so good.
Such a good book. Oh, it is like that book is a Bible. Like it is.
Yeah.
But it's also not only like about what to do, but if you get totally nerded out on some of this stuff like I do, just the fact that she just all the different research and the studies and the papers that she found to back it up, it's just this like beautiful collection of like, has anyone ever looked at this? I'm like, I know who will know, and that's Nancy.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah. Especially like you said, it's a very practical approach to behavioral science, which I think is good in the creative spaces. So
yes. Yeah. Nancy gets that. I mean, she's got such a long background in advertising agencies that she gets creatives and she understands what they do and don't want to get. Right?
Yes.
So it's not that they can't, it's just that they're like, oh, can't be bothered. So she really does such a beautiful job of streamlining it.
100%. Well, we're going to dig in. Before we do, I want to announce our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Element. Element is an award-winning advertising agency optimizing e-commerce campaigns around profit. In fact, we've helped 13 of our customers get acquired, with one that sold for nearly $800 million and one that IPO'd. You can learn more on our website at element.com, which is spelled ELUMYNT.com. That said, on to the good stuff. What is the problem with the way that we currently approach strategic planning?
I would suggest that there are 2.
Okay.
One is that we don't. We just say, this is the strategy, here we go.
Sure.
And the other, I would say, is that we open it up almost too wide. So with extraordinary respect to Roger Martin, who knows more and has forgotten more about strategic planning than like anybody, it's interesting to me that a lot of times when we see a process for strategic planning, it starts with, okay, there's a thing that we're trying to do. There's a goal we're trying to achieve, a problem we're trying to solve. And then there's like, okay, let's figure out how we could do that. And then there's this massive brainstorming phase. And we've got all these possibilities that are brought out, and that at some point we say, okay, well then, like, what actually is realistic based on like what our internal revenue sources are and what our staffing is. Now that sounds good, and it is. And I would suggest, however, that there is a missing step between the what are we trying to do and the how might we. And what I mean by that is, there is something even deeper than all of the, do we have the people, do we have the revenue, et cetera. And that is based on what our organization does day in and day out, what our lived values and beliefs are, not just the ones that we say they are. What is actually possible here? What is actually aligned with what this organization does, what it believes, what we've done so far, just in principle. The reason why I think that's so important is because, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is it means that without unduly shrinking the number of suggestions that come on the table. Instead of doing that, it actually only puts suggestions on the table that would still be acceptable to the vast majority of people in the organization.
Sure.
As opposed to putting everything on the table, at which point, because somebody's put it on the table, what ends up happening is then you start cutting out things that people, based on maybe their own individual values and beliefs, might actually like. And then you start to invoke kind of loss aversion and prospect theory, where people start to fight against losing something. So I find that this idea of, let's understand why, like, what do we collectively believe is the right way to do things, not the tactics, but what are the principles that drive our tactics? If we start from a definition there, we end up with not necessarily just as many options, but we certainly end up with a lot more options that are at least actually practical in principle. And then everything else needs to happen. About, okay, like, do we have the people? Do we have the money? But I would rather do that and start only with the things that like actually feel right to us from a principle standpoint, than to do all these extra things and just do this exercise for the sake of doing the exercise, and then start to like disappoint people, frustrate people with all the things that we can't do, which is never a good place to start a forward moving process.
Yeah. It's almost like it halts all the momentum in a pretty significant way.
Yeah.
Would you say that if a business is stuck, they've plateaued at 10 million, 50 million, 100 million, they're at this point, and they've looked at other things that could be in the way, that maybe the thing that is likely in their way is this right here, this strategic planning piece of it, and that's what's kind of crippling their growth or keeping them from being able to move forward? Yeah.
Oh, that was a question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, like you would agree with that being the sentiment, because I've run into this on a number of times, and it's like there's a lot of things that I could point to it on other areas that it's like, well, maybe people are like, well, maybe we just need a new media buyer. Maybe that's not the thing, right? Or maybe we just need whatever this is, but it's like, or maybe the vision and the way that you're going about creating the right strategy for your team is missing the mark in some way, and that's why people can't get behind you, and that's where this stalled growth is coming from.
So I would say, again, there's probably two core. Yes, I agree. Let me start there. And I would say that there's two core reasons why I think that happens. Number one, there is either, so what you're describing, what I'm really describing, is whether or not an organization actually understands, it's going to sound pretty geeky, but whether or not it understands its own philosophy about what it's doing, right? Like, and why it's doing it. And I don't just mean the Simon Sinekian why of like, what's our purpose? What are we trying to do? I mean, what are the questions that we're answering in the marketplace? How are we answering them? And critically, why are we answering them that way? Again, that comes back down to what are our kind of operating theories of why we think these approaches work. So I think sometimes when organizations get stalled, it's because they don't know it at all. And so they're able, what they end up doing is they reach for this and they reach for that and they reach for that. In other words, they're grasping at tactics that are fundamentally misaligned with their kind of theory of the firm, to quote Peter Drucker, and therefore don't work, because they don't, like, you're never able to quite deliver on them, because something about them just is misaligned with what you do, how you do it, why you do it that way. The other case, and this is, I will tell you, I'm like on a mission to end this one as being the cause of it, is that they do know and they aren't communicating it, or they haven't said it out loud. And a lot of times people are saying, well, isn't that what our mission is? No. Isn't that what our brand is? No. Like, this is literally saying, like, we do it this way. We build this software as a service, this social media platform we have is built the way that it is because we believe in comprehensiveness and information. If we don't understand the whole picture, then we don't understand what any individual part means. And we believe in a consistency. Meaning we need to be able to have a consistent language across those measurements so that that whole picture makes sense and we can actually make the comparisons that are necessary to understand how every individual pixel in that picture is functioning. And that's why we do what we do the way that we do it. Those pieces, because I think they are so inherent to why an organization operates the way that it does, it literally doesn't occur to them to say it out loud. But it's those things. It's comprehensiveness and consistency, let's say, that are exactly why they are the perfect solution for certain clients, where they also value those things and put them up as the highest things that they could be. So to me, really, if there's stalling, it's because there's one other reason. I'll get that in a minute. But if they're stalling, the two reasons to recap so far is just like either they don't have it and they've never actually bothered with it. And I'm going to argue that they have it anyway, whether they think so or not. And then the second thing is it's not been articulated explicitly. So they're not benefiting from both the internal and external focus and amplification they could get from understanding actually really what it is. The last thing I would say is maybe they do have it, but they haven't really updated it given the changing context of the environment, right? So that, it's kind of that thing where if 3M had stayed as like a mining company, then they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. But ultimately they basically said, actually what's most important to us as a company is not the question we're trying to answer. How can we find more coal? It's how do we approach finding more coal, right? And it's basically how do we take these insights of science? How do we apply them to life? And if they take away that question and all of a sudden they look at what they've already built that's really, really strong, they're like, oh, we can take this and apply it to all sorts of stuff, especially stuff that's sticky, right? And so that's what I'm saying is that it's sometimes if there's a stalling, it's because there's been a hold on to like, well, we solved this problem. And I'm like, actually, your longer term benefit is in why you employ the strategies that you do, not why you employ the tactics that you do, because those are going to come from the strategies. But why do you solve those questions that way? Because that's actually A, much more stable long term, and B, those are already the muscles you've built. So if you're thinking about going forward to branding and marketing, they're going to be the ones that are already strong, already recognizable for what you're doing, and therefore easier to sustain long term and less likely to create some kind of gap where, like United, you say, fly the friendly skies, and then people's experience are not that, right? Like, so by starting with what you do actually do and why, I think it's just generally a much, much, much stronger strategic base.
It's beautiful. And so I'm going to come back to, I think, point 2, which is more on the communication side of this for this.
Yes.
There's a lot that I could uncover there.
Yeah.
If we're going to say, how do we move forward with improving this in order to get this to the point where there are 9 principles that we're actually going to get people to follow behind on this? One of the quotes that you had in your book that I liked is from Cicero. You said, if you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. How does this quote get people to start buying in to what it is the strategy is?
Absolutely. So what I would say to that, and what I do say to that, so I'm not just anticipating that I would say that, is that, okay, so the whole book really is about like the basic argument of the book is if you are looking for buy-in for change. So let me define those two things real quick. Buy-in, meaning somebody believing enough in something to act on it out of internal motivation, and change as opposed to action, meaning action could be one time, extrinsically motivated, et cetera, but change, for something to be changed, it is a sustained action and it's sustained by that internal motivation. So if we're looking to build buy-in for change, then there's really 2 principles that rise to the top of all of this that are really, really important. Number 1, and it is principle number 2, is that every decision has a story behind it. And one of the ways that let me say that again. I said that very quickly. Every decision has a story behind it. Meaning, whether we realize it or not, anytime we make a decision, we are telling ourselves a story about why that decision makes sense. right?
Mm-hmm.
And generally we are doing that unconsciously until we're questioned, and then we pull up reasons, right? And they may or may not be the actual reasons, but we're going to pull up reasons. So another way I say this is that every action ends an internal argument in our head, again, about why that action does or doesn't make sense. And yet another way to think about that is that we always, humans, I don't care how technical you are, how engineering-y you are, how formal and whatever you are, every human operates according to their own internal logic all the time. So that argument is going to follow the same process, and it's going to rely on the same existing premises. In other words, the pre-existing reasons that are ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
That leads me to the second principle. So not only does every action end an internal argument, usually one you're not aware of, but second, the arguments we agree with are based on beliefs and desires that we already have. So the whole argument for the book is basically saying, well, because of those two things, because every action ends an argument, and the arguments we agree with are based on beliefs and desires we already have, the best way to build buy-in, to build that internally motivated action that will sustain change, is to build that story that somebody will tell themselves. In other words, build the argument with elements they either already or intuitively agree are true. And so when it comes to kind of really thinking through, okay, how do we do this and all it, so much of that is about figuring out how do we start by articulating that argument. And a lot of times, based on what we were just talking about, that means we actually have to start with, why are we telling ourselves that it's true? Because if we're trying to get it out to the marketplace, or even just internally, when we're saying, hey, let's start this new project, let's do this initiative, somebody believes that that's a good thing to do, and they've got reasons to do it. And here's the kicker: it's not the data, right? It's like the data is useful because the data validated some kind of gut response, not an emotional check, an intuitive check on that makes sense. And so really what the book is articulating and advocating for, what I'm advocating for, it's not just I wrote the book, is that, just details. What I'm advocating for is basically saying we need to craft that argument that passes that gut check that really determines whether or not someone's going to listen to anything else after it. So, because if somebody doesn't, if I say the best way to do this is this, and you're like, no, it isn't, which is an intuitive response, not necessarily emotional, just like, no, not based on what I know, that's not the right way. How likely is it that any level of case study, testimonial, years in business, data, evidence, whatever, is going to change their mind? It is not. Right. So unless we can start with things that they agree are true, why is comprehensiveness important when we're talking about reporting in social media? Why is consistency important when we're talking about that? Then they now understand why you have the elements that you have. And by the way, since so few companies do this, the fact that you do is automatically going to separate you, differentiate you, and make it much, much harder for any competitor to come in, because they probably don't even know why they've got the features they do, but this company does.
I like the way that you've worded this, even the difference between it's not an emotional response, it's an intuitive response. To a point, I would say one of the benefits that I've experienced in my own business was there was a part of me that thought that writing down your mission, vision, values was just pointless until we did it. And I went through this process and we got there, and I could see how having those there enabled the team to say whether or not they align, but it also made it a lot easier for us from a recruitment standpoint to say, like, are these people the people who already agree with what we already are doing in the culture that we have? And so I'd say to a point, there's that idea where it's like the easiest way to get buy-in is to start with buy-in, maybe, right? Like, already have like the right people.
Right.
And they're going to go about this. But the reality is some of the things that we're going to do are going to change, right? Like whether or not we have this feature, whether or not we are doing this, going from cold to sticky notes, or whatever it is that you're talking about there. And so now you have to say, okay, if you already agreed with how we got from A to B before, can I take you from A to C through B, kind of almost like, can I take you here through the same process now with a different problem, and telling that story. And so I think that makes sense. Like you said, it's because it's intuitive. Now you're saying, I'm going to align with what you already feel is true in your heart, in your gut.
That's right. And if you don't feel that's true, you are like, we can respectfully part ways. And I think that's really important, whether we're talking about hiring, whether we're talking about sales, whether we're talking about change management. Again, we can respectfully part ways because we have a mutual understanding of where we're coming from. Because if I don't agree that comprehensiveness is important, when I fully understand why you say that it is, I just don't see the world that way. That's not important to me. Fine. Right. Because I can either, as a salesperson, try to convince you why it's important, which is much more likely to just start to set off all of the psychological principles that are going to work against that, some of which I talk about in the book. Or I could just go, you know what? I'm going to go look for people who do believe that, and then we're going to work it up from there. And so I, while my most recent work before I started my own business was in sales messaging, I spent the majority of my career before that in branding and marketing. And there's this perennial tension between marketing and sales. And I really wanted to get into sales messaging so I could say, like, what are we doing in marketing that's like ticking you guys off so much? And it's like, and then I was like, oh, I get it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. But the thing is that marketing, the issue I completely agree that a company should have a brand, a mission, a vision. You should have your espoused values and beliefs. And if I could like wave a magic wand and say, there's one other critical piece that needs to be part of your core company documents, I would say that it's this kind of core theory, right? It's this core philosophy, because that's based on why you do what you do right now, the way that you do it. And so, because any set of values, and I work with some startups that work with a very good system of EOS, right? Like they use the EOS approach and it's great. And I had a conversation with one of my clients that had just finished that process. And I said, so I'm just curious, because I'm literally curious, because I was just learning about EOS at the time. I said, of these values, how would you score yourselves on them right now? And they were like, oh. And I'm like, and are you operating in certain ways where someone would go, yeah, that's not where you are right now? They're like, oh, absolutely. I said, okay, so we need something that says, why are we doing what we're doing right now? So that we can identify sometimes where are there gaps and what are we going to do to close them? Because I think sometimes when we just establish our brands and our visions, we're like, yep, all done. And we don't take a look at like where we are right now. We're like, yeah, we're not there yet. So what do we need to do to get there? And like I said, based on what we were talking about before, I believe to my core that the things that you are already doing and why carry enormous power in the marketplace. Because I would suggest that certainly is true of individuals, that our outlook is our only truly unique thing. Like the way that you see the world, why you believe, like that whole collection of why you think it operates the way it does and what you think is right and why you think it is right. For you, William, as an individual, for me, that collection, there's no way anyone could absolutely reproduce that. Elements, sure. I believe the same thing is true of companies, that there are like, they've got a very unique philosophy and perspective about why they do what they do, even if they're in a commodity industry, even if they've got a commodity product. And one of my favorite examples of this that people seem to like as an example of this is like Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts.
Sure.
They both answer the same question with the same product. But why they do what they do in their own particular way completely changes what that actual product looks like, feels like, what the whole experience is, what the whole brand experience is, right? And just as an example, like we can work backwards from Dunkin's tagline, America runs on Dunkin'. Okay. So one of the things, if they sell coffee, and they do, is that there has to be a belief there, a principle there about what they believe coffee represents. Like, what is coffee? If America runs on Dunkin', you can figure this out. Anybody can figure this out. What is coffee to them? What do they think coffee is?
Fuel to get stuff done.
Fuel. Exactly.
Yeah.
And if America runs on it, what do they believe about the experience of getting coffee? It should be fast.
Yeah.
So if you can say, all right, we are trying to find like fast fuel at Dunkin'. Now you say, oh, well, now it's a lot easier to come up with a tagline, by the way. But B, you can also see how that is lived out in the whole experience of Dunkin'. Food that you can eat with one hand. Like they maximize the speed with which you can come in and come out. Like it's a fairly limited menu. There's nothing that you would want to sit and eat. You don't want to sit and eat in any of their stores. Like everything's hard and sticky. Like you don't want to be. I love Dunkin'. I'm in Boston.
Sure.
We like Dunkin' has my heart. But contrast that with Starbucks. Clearly, Starbucks has a different perspective on what coffee is. Now, if you believe their branding on their stores, I don't, that coffee is togetherness. They keep saying that coffee is community. No, it's not. I'm sorry. Because again, that's one of those places where there's a clear difference between their what's known as an espoused value, an espoused principle, and then the one that's in use. I would agree that they believe that coffee is an experience. And they would like it to be a community experience, but fundamentally coffee to them is an experience. That's actually what is more played out by the experience that you have as their brand.
Sure.
And I would suggest that instead of saying, okay, like we need that fuel fast, we need an experience. We need an experience that actually kind of serves a purpose of like a certain kind of experience, right? And if we think all the way back to Starbucks beginning, they were talking about the third place. We need a place where we can actually take a break from everything else. In other words, something probably along the lines of the experience flavors the coffee. So not only is coffee an experience, but the nature of the experience, the coffee break, the break is actually more important than the coffee. And then again, think about how that carries forward in the rest of the brand. Things are soft. You've got an extensive menu. They have music. They have Wi-Fi. All of these things, other than their recent rule that says you have to buy something to keep staying there, says to them, coffee is an experience. But now you start to see how, like, if they start to lose the true understanding of what their philosophy is, they start to make choices off of it. Right now they've started to say, well, you have to buy something extra. I'm like, all right, well, now you've just kind of, how together is it if I have to buy my way into togetherness, right? You know, so this is one of those things where I keep coming back to, it is really important to get these things out loud.
Togetherness wasn't the real thing. To your point,
it wasn't.
And when I think about togetherness now, if I say like coffee as community, I'm going to give a shout out to a small little coffee shop in Canton, Ohio, my hometown, Mugswig's Coffee, because that is what it is. When you go there, they've got the board games and people are actually playing games and people are playing chess and they have open mic nights and poetry nights. And you go. If Starbucks was going to say coffee is community, that would be the thing that I've never been to an open poetry night ever at a Starbucks. Maybe they have them, but I'm not aware of them. Right. But that's what I would say that is that. But to your point, coffee is an experience. Sure. And if you want to pay for that, if you want that experience, you got to pay for it. Right. So sure, you got to pay for the coffee. Okay, got it. Coffee's an experience. Okay, I can buy into that.
And what I would suggest is actually the experience to date of Starbucks, and I'm really just realizing this as you're talking about because it's such a beautiful contrast, is if you really think about it, Starbucks is about individual experience. It's about, I get a quiet place to just be by myself and maybe I'm hanging out, but there's not a lot of like people hanging out with other people at Starbucks. Right. So I look at it and I go, gosh, but what a valuable thing that is to have a quiet place where I can just, maybe if the cost of entry is a coffee every 2 hours or my favorite, a London fog latte every 2 hours, I'm a tea drinker. Fine. But it's like, again, like they want to be like from a brand. This is one of the point where the marketing people like got a hold of it. And I'm like, y'all, no, because the marketing people were like, well, let's be about community. And I'm like, and you're anti-union, Starbucks. Sure. So again, like we're togetherness, but not if you're in a union. And again, whether I have opinions on that or not, I'm saying it is they are operating in other ways that are against what they are saying out loud, which means, again, back to various theorists who is arduous and shown, if you want to be very specific about it, who talk about this difference between espoused values and values in use. Meaning, and again, a lot of times we're not aware that there's a difference. But if you observe behavior over time, because of that operation from internal logic, you can observe the values in use, particularly over time. Like one instance of data is not going to tell you. But if you look over time, if you see that over time, your experiences with United are not friendly, and if you see that over time, there is, organizational and individual experiential elements of Starbucks that would not suggest togetherness or community. And in fact, you have examples where there are folks doing that a lot better. Then now you've got something that not only says, okay, we really need to figure out what we're actually doing here, because another brand could eat our lunch on this message because they are doing it a lot better than we are. Because it's actually core to them, right? Like that, it's actually core to them.
Yes. I was just trying to look up like a slogan here for a company. I don't think I'm going to find it fast enough. I was just trying to go to their website. But the idea here being that it's like, okay, on the e-commerce side, if your slogan is, let's just say helpfulness or whatever this might be, right? Where it's like you're the most helpful e-commerce store in your niche. Then everything that you do is going to communicate that to the customer. And so or it should, right? Like if it's a true value, and if it doesn't,
they're going to be like, I don't trust you.
Right. Yeah. Well, right. Which is even interesting to even claim a value that's not evident is not only is it not helpful, it is detrimental to you.
100%, because it starts to erode the know, like, and trust that we all know is necessary for successful long-term sales relationships. Yeah. I mean, I think you start to see why I get like all fired up about this stuff, because at some level, I'm like, it just doesn't even make sense. I don't care if you even can care about the ethical aspects of it. Even if you're just looking at the economic aspects of it, it doesn't make sense, because it's eroding what we all generally agree is true about what's successful for long-term alignment, long-term loyalty, like retaining customers and clients. That relies on trust. And trust means I get what I expect to get from you every time. You keep your promises. And that is like, and are you going to screw up every now and then? Yeah. And if I have enough history with you to go, okay, that wasn't awesome, then that's fine. I'm going to give you that grace generally, but not if we've only ever had a transactional relationship. And this is where, back to Starbucks, I get a little worried about but you have to pay to be here, because now it's transactional, and they've made it officially transactional. And it reminds me, this is how my brain works, so I apologize. How there was this study that was done about, trust me, this relates.
I love it.
Child care centers. Like, I don't know if you've got kids. I've got kids. They're no longer like at daycare. But they did this study where, one of the biggest problems that daycare centers deal with is parents picking their kids up late. Okay. Sure. And what they found was they did a study where they said, okay, well, let's put a late fee on. Like if you're late, for every 15 minutes late, it's X amount of money. And what they found was it actually made the late pickups worse.
Because it was convenient to those people. And so they're like,
that's right.
Hey,
and now they could actually say, rather than saying like, is it like, instead of just saying, as a human, I am putting out this person who is taking care of my child. As soon as they made it transactional, now they could make it. I'm like, well, is it worth it to me to spend $50 to be 10 minutes late? Yep. Guess what? I'm going to be 10 minutes late because it's only $50. Now that's not, maybe that's significant to some people, but again, if you think about all the economics and in daycare and if you've got kids in daycare, it's like private college. So it's like $50 is nothing compared to the whole thing that you're paying. So, but you see what I mean? Like I am so interested in this. And this is part of what my doctoral research is trying to get to is how can we more easily express these values in use, these theories in use that are actually driving what we're doing, because I see that it affects so much about our business strategy, about our product strategy, about how we treat our people, about how our organization operates internally and externally. It can finally inform our communication, sales, and marketing strategies in a way that is consistent with the experience people will actually have, that I'm like, oh, we've got to figure this out. And the faster we can figure it out, the better. And also, I think there's an opportunity for us to like actually find a lot more common ground than we have found before. Because when it really comes down to what do you actually believe in your heart of hearts, that's important, and you bring that to the fore, then you have that opportunity to go, yeah, actually, that's right. And because again, humans love, just both consciously and unconsciously, want to be consistent with their beliefs. If we can bring those beliefs forward, your own first as an organization, then and they understand those beliefs and agree with it, then you've established right at the beginning a gorgeous ground for that know, like, and trust, because you've said, not buy my thing, you've said we believe. And that's why we create this thing that is available for you to buy. Right?
Yes.
And that I find is like, it avoids all the pressure tactics that drive people away from you.
Yeah.
It quickly identifies who are your people and who are not. And it like I said, it carries with it the core elements of know, like, and trust, which is, I know you. If you're revealing to me your deeper beliefs, that's a level of exposure, transparency, et cetera, that we don't get a lot of, particularly from companies. Well, I like the fact that you did that because I don't get that. And, or also I can see, do I like what you believe? Do I like how you think? Does that make sense to me? And if it does make sense to me, I'm much more likely to trust it, especially if what you're saying is consistent with what I can see that you're actually doing out there in the world.
And for those that are following along in the book, if I remember correctly, this would be principle 3, right? Patterns. What is it? Patterns.
Principle set patterns.
Principle set patterns. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the big way that I put this whole idea that, the arguments we agree with are based on beliefs we already have. Because our principles are the things that our intuitive brains go to first. Like it's what have we always seen to be true? Like in that split second where I'm making a decision about what I've heard or what you're suggesting to me or what you're telling me, the only thing I have time to access, the only thing my brain has time to access is what's already in there. And so understanding what's already in there is really important, as is, in my belief, talking to that part of your customers, prospects, prospective clients' brains first. Basically say, okay, we're going to tell you that this does this thing, but we're also going to tell you why it does that thing. Not that it does that thing, but why it does that thing. And we're going to explain it in such a way that your brain goes, yep, I could see why that would work. Now, is the onus still on you? Is the burden still on you, the company, to show that what they can see would work in principle actually does work in practice? Absolutely. Do they still need evidence, case studies, testimonials? Absolutely.
Yep.
But if we can give them that kind of crisp, clean, because therefore, then not only do we get them to understand that and agree it in principle, it immediately becomes a lot easier for them to explain it to somebody else. Right. And not in not in this unnatural, now, so often we're asking people to parrot our marketing language when they are our advocates internally. And I don't know about you, I feel like a jackass if I'm saying somebody's tagline, because it's like, that's not my tagline. But if you've expressed what you do in a way that I can go, yeah, I'm definitely coffee is fuel kind of girl, then it's a lot easier for me to be like, here's why I love Dunkin', right? Because it's like, I don't want to spend any time with anybody else. Just get me my coffee in, out, let me get on my way as fast as I possibly can. And I can explain to you without going, well, it's because coffee is togetherness. And I like that. Yeah. I mean, it's like, no one's going to do that. But when you speak in the language of belief, and what's crazy, it's the logic of belief that's actually what we're talking about here. Which sounds like an oxymoron, but it is in fact a paradox, right? Like it's actually true that it's a logical belief. Then when we speak that language, we are much more likely to get not only the understanding that's critical for action towards sales and things like that, but we're also getting the agreement, internally driven agreement based on things that we have believed for a very long time, right? I forget which one specifically, but the longer we believe, the stronger the belief, right? I should know what my numbers are, but the reason I'm stumbling on that one is because it used to be the actual principle, and then we were paid it, or that we changed it. Yes, that's the one that goes with deepest beliefs are hardest to shift.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
Well, it leads me, I think, into identity or principle 4. I feel like identity is the greatest influencer. Like, and if I understood this to be what you're saying too, where it's like, well, now as me as the individual, let's just say as the customer or as the employee, because we're talking about, change within an organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I identify in that way, then I'm like, yeah, great. Like this helps to support my identity because I believe that is the right identity. That is the right way to solve this problem.
Yeah, you can say, well, I have that belief too. And so now you're asking me not just to implement this thing, which if left to my own devices, I may fill in that logical argument with, again, I'm only going to pull on what is fastest for my brain to pull, which means it may pull pre-existing beliefs that work against what I'm trying to do. And this is why if you're the person suggesting the change and you put yours out there, again, it's not about denying them their beliefs. Like it's another point that I make later in the book. This isn't about challenging their beliefs. It's about kind of just putting a different set in front. So one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, you're the first person to hear this out loud. So I know, like very exciting. So there's this great book put out probably 10, 12 years ago now by the Heath brothers called Switch. And it was really very much a book about motivation, decision to action. It was I think the first book after they wrote Made to Stick. And they brought in this beautiful analogy of how the brain works, where they referred to as the elephant and the rider. All right, meaning that the elephant was kind of the fast, intuitive, instinctive brain, which was controlled primarily by the rider, right? The human, the rational person who could control the elephant. It is a simplification, obviously, as all analogies are, but it's a really useful visual thing where you're like, like there's this giant, big, strong thing, and then this little tiny human trying to just like make it move has limited capacity on that one. The more that I research this, the more that I realize that the basic idea is solid, but it is closer to, in certain ways, the analogy that analogy was based on. Again, I'm a total nerd. So that analogy was based on one by Plato, where it actually described kind of the human nature as a charioteer with two horses. One which was like our, the better angels of our nature and our virtues, and the other one was kind of our vices. So if we kind of like take all that and put it together, I think, first time on air, I think a great way to think about the brain is as a musher and a sled dogs. And the reason why is because we still need that human, rational, in nominal control, titular control of what's happening. But the reason why I think the sled dogs are important is because, we went to Alaska 2 summers ago. We went to a sled dog camp, and they explained how all this works. Is that they'll switch out which dogs are the lead dog depending on what they're doing, and different dogs are like serve different purposes in the line, right? And so if you've got the wrong dogs, like trying to go on the wrong terrain, you're not going to get there very well, right? So part of this idea of like really looking at what do people already believe to get to their identity is saying, I'm not telling you get rid of that dog. I'm just saying, we're going to swap this other one in to be the lead dog at the moment because that one is going to be better at getting where you're trying to go. It also still maintains the idea that these are animals. These are wild animals. And if they see like, if they get to a point where something is triggered in them, like my dogs, you know this, we'll talk about it later.
Greyhounds.
Both of them are retired racing greyhounds.
Yeah.
If they see a rabbit, they're going to go, right? And it doesn't matter how beautifully trained they are or whatever. I mean, they're actually much better now. But that's what it's saying. It's like, if triggered, like those dogs are still going to go where they want to go. They're still going to behave like dogs when they're when they're allowed to behave like dogs. But we do have, as humans, control over something and again, if we don't pay attention, the last arrangement of dogs is going to be the one that's in play. But I believe that leaders internally to an organization, when you're explaining, like, here's why I've ordered my dogs this way, because this is where we're trying to go. This is what I think is necessary. So this is what I'm pulling into play. It allows someone to go, I'm trying to go to the same place. I see what you're doing. I've got those dogs in my lineup too. I'm going to switch them as well. And they get to be their own thing, and we're all going to get there faster together. Now, there may be that point where someone goes, I'm not trying to go that place. Okay. Then we're going to have a different conversation. Or they're like, I don't share that belief, which again, opens a conversation to say, okay, well, is there some other dog that we can agree would be functional here? Or do we just really not going to see this the same way? And then what does that mean for us? But I think that ultimately, one of the things that comes from that fourth principle of that identity is the greatest influencer really does come back to the beliefs contained in that logic of belief, which is it's that set of dogs that allows us to feel who we are, like that allows us to go where we go and to do what we do and allows us to be like, yep, this is me, this is what I'm doing. And so the more that we can say, I'm not asking you to suddenly use hippos, right?
Sure.
Or I'm not suddenly asking you to go someplace else that your dogs are not equipped to go, which is essentially what we're doing a lot of the time when we're giving people messages. We're saying, no, your dogs are no good. You need this. You need these things instead. And you're denying somebody the thing that has worked for them forever, right? Or at least recently. So it's really important to understand that whatever we're doing, like you've got your line of dogs, but so do they. And so how can we get all those dogs working together to get to the same place?
Yeah. It's such a powerful concept. I really like that idea of these two different lines of dogs here that you're talking about. If for those who are also nerds in this, I believe I learned the term from you in your book. So correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that was Plato's anagnorisis, right?
Yes, the
which
anagnorisis.
Was when two truths fight, only one wins. And I wrote that one down too because I was like, oh, I like that.
Yes. So I also quote Fitzgerald in that chapter, because a lot of times people, when I first say that to people, again, the instinctive response, the things because that's a news statement to people. Sure. I came up with it, so you haven't heard it before. The two truths fight, only one wins. What that reminds people of, and what oftentimes their intuitive response is, well, what about Fitzgerald, who says that it's a mark of intelligence that I can hold two opposing beliefs in my head at the same time? And I'm like, you're absolutely correct. So is he. We do it all the time. But it goes back to the sled dogs. You put two of those dogs head to head, one of them's going to be better given where you're trying to go. Full stop. But they can both be in the line, right? At the same time, meaning I can have those beliefs, but in one situation, one of them is going to be dominant. And in another situation, the other one's going to be dominant. And so when it comes to creating the conditions for this kind of internal awareness that may lead to change, or this internal understanding that may lead to change, it's about putting those things head to head, where you're basically saying, well, if you want to go here, and you believe these things as I do, now we've got a choice, because it means either, whatever you've got arranged right now isn't going to get there based on what you've agreed to be true. So what that now means is either you decide you don't want that thing that you previously had said that you both want. Again, that's fine. You may decide when it comes down to it's just not worth it. If this is the change that has to be made, totally okay. Second, or you decide I have to unbelieve one of these things that if, I as the leader has done my work of trying to find it as to be as foundational a belief as I can get. So it's as kind of understandable and as inarguable as possible. If you don't want to believe that, okay, either you have to unbelieve it. I mean, that's what I'm asking you to do is unbelieve it. Or, and this is generally the easiest thing to shift, or I'm just going to rearrange my dogs.
Sure.
Like, that's it. I'm just going to rearrange my dogs. But you can't do that if they haven't been given the whole picture about, again, not why their thing isn't going to work. It's you're giving them the picture of why you believe your arrangement, your strategy is going to work given what dogs you have.
Sure.
And if they look at it and go, I've got the same dogs. I want the same thing. I've got them in a different order, but I've got a different one in front. Oh, interesting. I can see now why that dog is good for that, but it's not going to be the best one here. Let me switch. That's really what we're trying to do is just say, how can we get just basically say, this is why I believe this. Yeah. And this comes to a piece of research that I've come across since I wrote the last book, which is nerd alert.
Love it.
Habermas's theory of communicative action. So there's a philosopher named Jürgen Habermas who really talks about that there's kind of two different fundamental uses of communication. And one is what he calls strategic action and one is communicative action. And that doesn't matter other than basically he's saying we can use words where words are kind of incidental to getting across that if you do this or don't do this, there's going to be consequences that you're either going to really like or really not. So that the words aren't really about the only understanding I'm trying to get you to understand is what the consequences of not agreeing with me are. Generally. Yep. And then there is, and the other category of, I am just trying to make sure that we both understand with crystal clarity where we're coming from. Because I believe that if I do a good enough job with that just your understanding of my perspective on this, my theory about why this would work, if you see enough the world the way that I do, or enough of it the way that I do, you'll see why I believe that. Right. And then it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to decide as well. That's really the difference between the two. But what's key here, William, is that Habermas says you cannot do both at once.
Sure.
It's one or the other. And so what I realized after I wrote this book was that I was apparently I was a devotee of Habermas, but without even knowing it, because really that's what this book is all about. It's about saying, this is how to communicate to achieve action through mutual understanding, not through let me articulate the incentives or the consequences. In other words, it's not for those situations where saying no actually isn't a choice. If that's actually the case, if there really isn't a choice, or this is you're really not motivated from really wanting somebody, truly wanting them to decide on their own, for this truly to be internal, none of this applies, frankly. Yep. Again, that's fine. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we need to do that. But it really is about saying, from this perspective of what would happen if we just said, this is what we believe. If we just said, and this is another thing I've been kind of coming to more recently, this is the position I take on this. This is the position we take on this. This is the position we are taking on this change, that we believe that this change will accomplish this thing for our company. Here's why. Don't go right to the data. Don't just say because it's going to accomplish that thing, because this change represents the combination of these two central principles, central beliefs, central values that we hold. And because we hold them, that's why this makes sense. It also happens that data supports us, but this is why we believe it. We're going to take that position. And again, back to marketing, I believe that if you part of the reason why people have such a hard time finding their position is because they haven't taken one in the first place. So this is really about, it's like, take your position, state your claim, and state your case for that claim. And just about everything else, based on what I've seen over 25 years doing this now, becomes a whole heck of a lot easier.
Yeah, you took it exactly where I wanted to go, which is in the practical sense, how do we do this? And there's a little bit more I want to unpack there.
Sure.
But you reminded me of a quote that I really appreciate, which is, and I don't know who said it, and I'm frustrated that I don't remember. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And it's one of my favorite quotes of all time.
That's a good one. Yeah.
But to your point, where it's like the best version of change is going to come from like this mutual understanding. That's the change that actually is going to take place. You also talked about saying no. If that's not the case, for them to say no, it reminded me so much of parenting. And I do think a lot about when I'm working with a team, I think very much about working with my kids. And to your point, the same thing happens as a parent. It's like, hey, do you want to take a bath? Well, you've just given them the opportunity to say no. That was the wrong question. The question should have been, what time would you like to take your bath? Now there's no. You're taking a bath. What time do you want to take the bath?
Yeah, but you're still giving them agency about when that bath happens.
Absolutely.
That was like one of the best parenting shifts that I was delighted that you said that, because if you didn't, I was going like, hey, this works really well. 100% like that. And I mean, and there's so much research on how not doing that as a leader can really erode your people's like and trust for you as well. In other words, we've all had leaders who are like, I want to get your opinions on this. And they're doing it because they think they're supposed to. But fundamentally, they are not going to change their opinion. And they're not even going to really take into account anything they've just asked for. At which point, most people would say, could you just have told us that this is the way it's got to be? And start with that. Because a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but I know I personally have way more respect for you saying, I wish I could give you a choice in this, but I can't. Right? One of the best things I learned from one of my therapists was that phrase. I wish it could be otherwise, but it can't. Which at least gets to say, I get, reality is reality. I mean, I think that, whether you want to go for the Buddhist's desire is the cause of all suffering, or my personal self-developed, I think, definition of stress, which is that it's wishing things to be other than they are. The thing is, a lot of us would just say, just give it to me straight. Yeah. And that's really what we're doing. And I would say that the difficulty is, and it's so much a theme of what we've been talking about, William, is that we're not always aware of what it is that's actually driving our decisions. Yeah. But what I have seen is that, and this is where I think it's magic, and it is frankly why I went, took myself back at 50 to school, was to say, I believe that creating this argument is a depressurized, de-emotionalized way to help someone just articulate what their internal perspective is on something. Like, why do they believe that? And not in a way that is, well, that's silly, because we're not saying that. It's like, no, there's a reason why you believe it. Like, let's keep going. Let's keep going. It's going to be there. And what's most exciting for me with the work I do with clients is that they do it, and they learn to do it, and they get better and better at doing it. And I mean, that's, as I'm discovering from my schoolwork as well, that's supported by research, is that, generally there's two kinds of learners, that there are people who learn based on example, and the people who learn, they're able to kind of like extract the rule. What does that mean? Think of like any Aesop fable, tortoise and the hare versus the moral of that story. Slow and steady wins the race. The story of the tortoise and the hare is the example. And so some people need like a bunch of examples like the tortoise and the hare to go, oh, if you're just, slow and steady, you'll get the race. And then some people can read that story and go, got it. That's about this. And then once they see that, they can start to see it everywhere. Sure. But Aesop was a smart guy, because what research now shows is that once people understand what the rule is underneath an example, they can start to see it in other examples that they haven't seen before. Sure. And so this is one of the reasons why, a lot of times I'm working with leaders and, if I'm talking, or if I'm working with folks on developing content, this is why it's so important that anytime you tell a story, which are really important, like they're useful, we need stories too, but we've got to state the underlying principle that story was meant to illustrate. Because otherwise, either people go, well, that's a nice story, and they won't see the rule because they weren't, or they could fill in the rule with the thing that they think it illustrates. And one of my favorite little nuggets of trivia here is that the whole story of the tortoise and the hare was originally, the principle it was originally teaching was that great gifts could be wasted by idleness. And you can just thinking through that story, you're like, oh my gosh, it teaches that lesson too.
Sure.
And you're like, oh, but you see, if like you don't say that, and I'm like, slow and steady wins the day, and then you're like, great gifts could be wasted by idleness. Each person could go, oh, well, that fast hare just needs to like work faster and they're going to win, which is a different outcome than the other one. Right. So anyway, this is why I'm so deeply interested in what these really kind of, theories in use actually are. So that we can, as leaders, get them out there, because the whole process of change, the whole process of transformation, and this is very well supported in the literature, particularly adult learning literature, is that you cannot get to change without changing your perspective on something, which means without changing the theory in use that you have to explain it.
New software.
And so this is where the whole philosophy of this book comes from, is saying, I have to tell you what mine is to give you to have any hope that you'll adopt it to, or at least to raise the probability that you'll adopt it to. Because if you hear it complete, then you don't have to do the work or the guessing or whatever of trying to fill it in. And so this is where I just see like very wired to like saving time. But it also works a heck of a lot faster. And because it's based on things that people already believe, what I see when I've been working, and I've been testing this framework now for 2 years, I can get there. I can identify that. We can identify what that theory in use is, what that perspective is on a particular thing in a day, and that may sound like, well, that's a long, but remember all of the things that unlocks, right? And how typically hard it is to get there. But what I've seen with companies is that they're like, oh my gosh, like now we can see what our core philosophy is. And we can see what our core philosophy for delivering on our mission, our core philosophy that's going to be the engine behind our brand, the core philosophy that is maybe not quite yet in line with the values we want it to be. So what are the strategic choices that we need to make in order to get there? What are the tactical things that we need to do in order to bring those two things closer in line? Obviously I'm very passionate about this, but it's because there's so much that I think that humans and companies are capable of, and words are both the problem, but they're also the solution, right? They're also the solution. We don't have anything better, right, than the words. But words, as concrete as they seem sometimes, they're actually really abstract. And we know that. We can actually experience that when we use something like authenticity. And that's going to mean one thing to you and one thing to me. And unless we question it, you're going to believe that I see it the way you do, and I'm going to believe that you see it the way that I do. And we could end up completely in the wrong place and just mystified why we're not like getting something done, or why you're actually doing something a certain way. And it's because you've just got a different way of looking at it. And that, I think, can solve a lot of problems.
This reminds me so much of just this concept of software within the brain, right? Where to your point, it's like you can't change without that. And it's like, I really like to look at this where it's like, if there's a thing that I'm struggling to do, a lot of times I have to think about, well, what's the software that I'm running right now? And how do I rewrite that software to run a different program? And once I do that, then doing the thing becomes very easy, right?
Yes.
And I would say,
I often refer to this as the operating system, right? Like of our brain. And what we're doing for any particular situation, any particular change, any particular, action that we take, any particular product or service is we're looking at like this process that I kind of quietly advocate for in the book is essentially by like opening a control window or like, seeing the code. Let's look at the source code here. Like, why are we doing it? Why does it look like this? Because there's lines of code that says it should look like this. So what are those? And because if we like the way it looks, that's great. The more we can understand why it works, then we can kind of make the most out of it. If we don't like the way it looks, and again, we can start to understand why is it looking like that? All right, now we've got something that we can work on.
The quote that I think you had that I think summarizes this the best that I really like is Isaac Asimov. So the universe is not quite as you thought it was. You'd better rearrange your beliefs then, because you certainly can't rearrange the universe. So good. And I think that kind of gets into this idea here. I want to transition this, though, into who is Tamsen Webster, because I like getting to know you.
She's a nut. Yeah.
No, this is good. We all are a little bit nutty.
Yeah. Well, I've decided in the last few years, and maybe it was hitting 50, that I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to like lean into the fact that I completely geek out about this stuff and I love it. And what I've found over time is that there's enough other people that also geek out about this that, it all works out.
Yeah, I'm a nerd. I'm learning to geek out on the stuff you geek out on, but I geek out on my own stuff. The name of the podcast actually is Up Arrow, which is a mathematical name for up arrow notation, which we use in math for making numbers that are much bigger than exponents. And so for people who are listening here, like, I don't know that. It's like, well, to get to Graham's number, which is the largest named number we have, you have to use up arrow notation. And so to me, it's a very, very nerdy concept that it's like just a little subtle thing to see if any other nerds come along and they're like, ooh, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I mean, I love puzzles. I know we've talked, we're getting to that, but that's part of it, right? It's just like, I love wordplay.
Well, let's start with that one. You're a cruciverbalist, like 500 days going straight. Like, why?
Because it's fun. So my longest streak of doing the New York Times crossword puzzle was like almost 2 years, and it killed me when I got past it. I'm like, oh, I forgot to do it. And it's not like Duolingo where you can like patch it over. You can patch it over with something. I'm like, dang it. I mean, part of the reason why I'm so passionate about what I do and this idea of it all being transferable skills, because I think a lot of people think of message design as, or message strategy as this like weird gift that weird people have. And what I have seen is that that is not the case. Now, does everyone have a needle that starts in a certain place? Yes, absolutely. And may that limit how far you can push the needle? Of course. But I mean, the thing is, I know it would be very difficult for people to believe, but I would say 10 years ago, I was not good at telling stories. I was really bad at making, metaphors and analogies. I was terrible at this stuff. And I looked at people who were good at it and I'm like, what are they doing? It's amazing. Right. And, some of this idea, like actually linking back to what we were talking about before, this idea of, coming up with a good metaphor, for example, a good analogy, a cool little story to tell, like you just did with Up Arrow, right? Is by understanding the thing that links it is the rule. So if I'm trying to illustrate this point to you, and as long as I know that point, what I can do is I can start to look for other things that illustrate that point. And then I can just kind of collect them in my head so that at some point when I'm trying to illustrate that point, I can pull out this thing. Well, you can also start it from the perspective of, let me just collect stories and random stuff, trivia, whatever. And sometimes I won't know where it will come into play, but I'll just like, oh, did you know? Like I have a client whose her name is Judy Holler, and she's decided to like totally lean into that as her brand, kind of like be the verb. And I said to her, well, you do know that there is a disproportionate number of dentists named Dennis, right? Like that there is this kind of like nominal predestination that happens where like there's research that shows that like people unconsciously like line up with whatever their name is, like not always, but she's like, no, how did you know that? And I'm like, no. But all of that is lateral thinking, right? So it's in other words, taking one thing and being able to see it as multiple other things at the moment. So, and that's fundamentally what something like a crossword is,
Mm-hmm.
or if you do like the LinkedIn games, which they've started lately, right? Like if you do things like connections or on New York Times, or if you do what's it called? It's called Pinpoint on LinkedIn. Those are things where you are, it's kind of testing and helping you develop the skill of seeing, I could read this word this way, which is the expected way to read it, or I can just step back for a minute and go, wait a minute, there's another way to look at this word. What is it? And so I love doing things like that, because to me, it's almost like, it's like my mental exercises. It's like going to my mental gym. It's like doing scales on the piano. By doing things like that, by doing those little logic puzzles, lateral thinking games, it just, particularly I do it usually first thing in the morning, it just gets my brain in the mode of thinking laterally, which is fundamentally one of the skills that my clients hire me for. Because if I'm working with you to develop your message about something, I need to be able to kind of pull down, what is that principle that's underneath this example that you just gave me? Or a lot of times when people can't put words to it, they'll give a metaphor or analogy or tell a story. And I need to be able to go, okay, what is the kind of grouping of principles this could be? And then I can say, so is it like this? Right. And then they're like, no, it's more like this. And I'm like, okay, this is this piece of it. So I just love stuff like that. I do, because I also learn things, because sometimes I'm like, I have no idea what this word is. What is this word? And then you're like, that's an amazing word. I had no idea. So again, then it just kind of gets like added to the pile of, now I think of them as pebbles, because again, random piece of information, potentially useful piece of information is now how I like to think about it. Penguins do this thing called pebbling, where they hold on to pebbles and they give it. So now I've decided that I'm really a penguin at heart. And I've just got like a giant pile of pebbles, and for, my clients and people I love, I'm like, here's a pebble. Like, here's a thing that might be useful. Here's my pebble. So I just love those things, because they are often unexpected sources of new and interesting pebbles.
I feel like our education system does a very good job of creating convergent thinking, but to your point, very difficult job at doing divergent thinking. And kind of what you were describing as this lateral thinking, I'm a big fan of as well, taking things from one area and applying it to a completely unrelated area. In the divergent thinking. And so when you talk about the games, the games that come to my mind there for that, it's like one of my favorites is categories, right? Where it's like the goal is to think of the thing that nobody else thought of for that letter and that, prompt or whatever that is.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, okay, you're like, oh, I can go this place with it. Yes.
Were you always this much of a nerd? And mean that in a nice way.
Yeah.
Were you always this much of a nerd? Like, what was your childhood like?
Yep. So I have a Navy commander father. He was a diesel submariner. I did not get that gene. Like, I don't know.
Sure.
Dad, wow. And my mother was a social anthropologist, much closer to the thing that I got. So my dad was very ordered and, hierarchical, and everything's got a system and everything's got a process. And from my mom is this kind of observational, like, what is happening, kind of thing. And I think that you get a lot of that just by osmosis and genes when you grow up in that kind of environment. B, we moved 5 times before I was 5. So even though that's not really kind of like rational thing, I think there is things that you have to like learn to borrow a phrase from my husband, like a self-entertaining unit, because you kind of have to, uproot, replant in whatever way. And I think you get fairly good at like assessing situations fairly quickly and trying to figure out how to operate in them. Now, adding a layer of insight into that I'm only starting to realize lately is that I also realize that I have some traits that I would say score very high into the autistic spectrum. And I think this idea of kind of like observing like how other people are and trying to figure out how they're operating so that I don't come across as much of a like weirdo as I think I really actually am on the inside. I think it's very related to that as well. And part of that all came into play with like when I went like, in high school, it's kind of like nascent version was I was an arts kid, but I was also the kind of the manager of the varsity boys baseball team. And so, I kind of operated in these typically you'd think of almost as divergent populations. Like, arts kids did not hang out with sports kids. This was like, this was the 80s. We were a full breakfast club at this point.
Yeah.
So like that is my childhood. That's what it was like. You did not have the Molly, you did not have the Ali Sheedys hanging out with the Emilio Estevez's. Like, that didn't happen. And then in college, I started by going with a very convergent thinking degree where I was like, I want to be employed, because in the early 90s, that was like one of the first of like 72 recessions we've had since I've been alive. And it was not easy to get a job. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm certainly not going to get a job as like a performer. So let me go for something where I'm actually going to be employed. Let me go for business. Bored stiff. And then I had really was. And I was like, y'all, this is not interesting. And I had, thankfully, a really good academic advisor who was like, you took all those AP tests for a reason. And I was like, oh. And it happened to be that Boston University, where I was going to school, if you had enough credits from AP, which I did, you could add a second degree. And I was like, yeah, I will do that. And so what I added was a liberal arts degree. So I had, as an undergrad, and then because I loved that experience so much, I did it again in grad school at the same time that I was getting this one focused professional degree that's like, you do things this way, here's why. There was also this, I was an American studies major with an art history minor. So I've got this like humanities degree thing going on over here. And then in grad school, got my MBA, but in organizational behavior. So it's kind of like, and managerial communication. So starting to blur the lines, but I was also it's kind of funny because I almost reversed them. So it was, an MBA, but organizational behavior. So almost a social science, right? Like it's a lot of, consumer behavior psychology. And then I got an arts administration degree with a focus on crisis communications. And then I stopped school for a long time. And that's why I took 25 years off before I went to school. Cause I got 4 degrees in 6 years and that was a lot. But I am so glad that I did it that way. I cannot tell you. I think I would absolutely not I would not be doing what I was doing right now if I did not have both sets of skills. And if I weren't able to easily speak both sets of languages. And thankfully that combination was enough of an overlap for me to add new languages. So, I spent 3 years doing the communication strategy behind the fundraising at Harvard Medical School. So like, that's a fun messaging challenge. Harvard needs money. No, it doesn't. It can use it better than a lot of people. That's a different message. And that's what we switched to. But it was also explaining to non-scientists what's known as basic science. And like, everyone's like, basic science, why are we funding it? I'm like, because it's the foundations of everything else. So yeah, I am with you on that. And I think that when I stopped going to school, like, I never stopped going to school, right? Like, do you see what I mean? Like that was always so helpful for me to always like be bringing stuff in from other places and to say, well, here's a problem that no one's been able to solve. And I'm like, well, have they been able to solve it someplace else? And so that was really what this new book was about, was to saying, business is always talking about like, how do we retain more employees? Like, how do we successfully create, because there's unsupportable, by the way, statistics about how many change management efforts fail. Why? And I'm like, I know this has been fixed in other places. And one of my favorite examples of like where business and, another, discipline has got totally different perspectives on this is the whole idea of leveraging pain, right? Like it's one of the biggest things in sales. Like you've got to make the pain of the status quo exceed the pain of change. And I'm like, if you've ever been to therapy, did they start with trying to like increase the pain of the stat? Were they trying to be like, you're doing it bad, it's only going to get worse unless you... No, because that is not the place for someone to make a transformational change. They're not going to start from that position. So anyway, yes, that's a very long way of saying I'm a big believer in kind of holding both styles of thinking and practicing both, because both are necessary. And I think if we want to kind of survive whatever's going to happen with AI, it's actually the people who can do divergent thinking that are going to win, agree. Because AI is actually better than we are at convergent. So guess what? Yeah.
Yep. Completely with you on that. I would say you've been collecting pebbles, and then it sounds like the 4 degrees in 6 years you were collecting a few boulders as well. So you've got some extra really big rocks to bring over.
Yeah.
I got time for one more, and I really want to get to it here as well.
Squeeze it in. Yes.
Which is you hung out with Guns N' Roses during Blizzard in the 90s, and that's the whole prompt that I'm going to say, and I'm going to let you tell the rest of it from here.
All right. So this actually feeds beautifully into what we were just talking about, which is, so there's this funny saying, I don't know if it's still true, if they still say it about BU, but they used to say that when BU in session, the tri-state area rose 3 feet out of the water. And what they meant by that was like BU was just basically where a whole bunch of rich kids from like New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut all went to school, plus a bunch of like Emirates and princes from, the Arab states. It was legit. I mean, and there was a very high concentration of those in the business school, which, as I've already talked about, I was like, yo, I don't understand you people. And so because I was not in the tri-state area and I was not a son, like royalty from the Arab states, I had to work while I was in school. And for whatever reason, I still don't really know how I did. I decided that the best thing for me to do to work was a job where I could do my homework there. Right. And so what that ended up being was I ended up being the box office girl at the nightclubs on Lansdowne Street, which is the big, it doesn't like, we used to have a lovely nightlife in Boston. We don't anymore. But like, that's where all my college friends are the folks that I work with in like Bill's Bar and Venus de Milo Club on Lansdowne Street. And what happened is because that was actually like the core of the nightlife of Boston, various bands in town, if they just wanted to hang out, would come to the clubs, particularly after their performances, right? When we were closing down, the bands would come in and then they'd oftentimes we'd basically keep the club open for them. There was a year where Guns N' Roses was in town. There was a blizzard, like they got snowed out of where they could go. And so they were just like hanging out at the Ritz. And so they were like, they basically took the entire staff of the club and they're like, come on over to the Ritz. So we hung out with Guns N' Roses like 2 evenings after work, just kind of like hanging out with them because they were bored and they were like, here's fun people to talk to. Let's do that. So yeah, I talked to Axel about Stephanie. He had just broken up with her at the time. He was drinking Cristal, had conversations with Matt Sorum, like Slash ended up like we went home the next day and there was Slash in my kitchen and I'm like, oh, hi. Like I didn't bring you here. Where did that happen? So it was a fun time.
That's pretty good. Tamsen, it's been so much fun getting to know you, learning from you. If people want to work with you or follow you, what's the best way for them to get in touch, stay in touch?
So I am literally the only Tamsen Webster spelled that way in the searchable universe. So you can find me on just about every platform except for X. And that way you can go to tamsenwebster.com, or if you really want to focus on the message design stuff, messagedesigninstitute.com.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
It's been so fun.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for listening. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.